The air was heavy with humidity, clinging to the skin like a damp blanket as the sun dipped below the horizon. The distant hum of crickets filled the suburban neighborhood, where a modest sedan pulled to a sudden stop at the edge of a quiet intersection. Marcus, a 36-year-old high school teacher, stepped out, adjusting his tie as he prepared to grab the groceries he'd forgotten in the back seat. His neatly pressed shirt and patient demeanor stood out in stark contrast to the rough asphalt and the dim glow of the streetlights above. Suddenly, the piercing wail of a police siren shattered the calm. Marcus turned, squinting at the bright red and blue lights flashing in rapid succession. A patrol car screeched to a halt beside him. "Hands where I can see them!" A voice barked through the megaphone, sharp and commanding. Marcus froze, his hands instinctively raised, confusion etched across his face. "Is there a problem, officer?" he called, his tone calm but edged with unease. The door of the patrol car slammed shut, and Officer Daniels emerged, his hand resting on the holstered weapon at his side. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a face hardened by years of service, and biases he didn't bother to mask. "We got a report about a suspicious man in this area," Daniels said, his eyes scanning Marcus with thinly veiled contempt. "You match the description." Marcus blinked, his brow furrowing. "Suspicious? I just got off work. I'm a teacher at Hamilton High." Daniels stepped closer, the click of his boots echoing ominously in the empty street. He towered over Marcus, his gaze narrowing. "You got ID on you?" Marcus nodded, slowly reaching for his wallet, his movements deliberate. "It's right here. No need to get aggressive." But the officer's hand tensed near his weapon, his voice growing sharper. "I said hands where I can see them." The tension crackled like static electricity as Marcus paused, his wallet half pulled from his pocket. His breath hitched, the gravity of the moment sinking in. "Look, I don't know what you think I did, but I haven't done anything wrong," Marcus said, his voice steady but firm. "Let me decide that," Daniels snapped, grabbing Marcus by the arm and twisting it behind his back. The teacher winced, the plastic grocery bag he had been holding falling to the ground, its contents spilling across the pavement. A few curious neighbors peered out from their windows, their silhouettes outlined against the dim interior lights of their homes. None stepped forward. "Officer, please, this is unnecessary," Marcus protested as he was shoved against the patrol car. "Quiet," Daniels barked, pulling out his radio. "Got a suspect detained on Pine and Willow." Bringing him in for questioning, Marcus could feel his heart pounding in his chest as cuffs tightened around his wrists. The humiliation burned like acid as his mind raced. Why was this happening? What had he done to deserve this? As Daniels pushed him into the back of the patrol car, Marcus caught sight of the scattered groceries, milk pooling onto the asphalt, a loaf of bread crushed underfoot. It was a small, insignificant detail, but it stung, a symbol of how quickly his normal evening had unraveled. Inside the car, the silence was suffocating. Daniels didn't speak, his expression cold and unreadable as he drove. Marcus stared out the window, his thoughts a swirl of indignation, fear, and frustration. Then Daniels broke the silence. "What's your name?" "Marcus Bradley," he replied tersely, his jaw clenched. Daniels frowned, his fingers tightening on the steering wheel. The name sparked something, a faint recognition that he couldn't quite place. "Bradley," he muttered, almost to himself. "What?" Marcus asked, his tone sharper now. "Nothing," Daniels snapped, though his grip on the wheel tightened further. The patrol car pulled into the station, the air thick with unspoken tension. As Marcus was led inside, Daniels glanced at him one more time, a shadow of doubt flickering in his steely eyes. This wasn't just another arrest. There was something about Marcus, his face, his name, that Daniels couldn't shake. It gnawed at the edge of his mind like an itch just out of reach. And though he couldn't quite put his finger on it, he knew one thing for certain. The night wasn't going to end the way he had expected. The fluorescent lights of the police station buzzed faintly, casting a cold, sterile glow on the tiled floors and concrete walls. Marcus was led through the front door, the faint scuff of his shoes echoing against the harsh silence. His wrists were still cuffed behind his back, the metal digging into his skin with every step. A receptionist glanced up from her desk, her expression shifting from casual indifference to surprise as she took in Marcus's professional attire and bewildered look. She opened her mouth to speak, but thought better of it when Daniels shot her a sharp glance. "Processing," Daniels said curtly, steering Marcus toward a side room. The room was small and bare, save for a table, 2 chairs, and a tired-looking officer tapping away at a computer. Daniels shoved Marcus into one of the chairs and nodded at the other officer. "Run his name," Daniels ordered, tossing Marcus's ID onto the desk. The officer hesitated, his eyes darting between Marcus and Daniels. "What's he in for?" Daniels crossed his arms, his stance rigid. "Suspicious behavior. Might be tied to a string of break-ins in the area." Marcus's head snapped up, disbelief flashing across his face. "Break-ins? Are you serious? I'm a teacher, for crying out loud. I just got off work." Daniels shot him a cold look, his jaw tightening. "Then you shouldn't have been hanging around where you didn't belong." "I live in that neighborhood," Marcus countered, his voice rising. "I've lived there for years. Ask anyone on that block." The officer at the computer cleared his throat, his discomfort evident. Daniels, his record's clean. Not so much as a parking ticket." Daniels's brow furrowed, and for a moment, his composure faltered. He stepped closer, looming over Marcus. "Doesn't mean he's innocent. People like you are good at covering their tracks." "People like me?" Marcus repeated, his tone sharp and incredulous. Daniels didn't respond, but the tension in the room thickened, suffocating and electric. The officer at the computer shifted uneasily, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. Marcus took a deep breath, willing himself to stay calm. He met Daniels's glare with unwavering resolve. "What exactly do you think I've done, officer? Because it seems like you're grasping at straws." Daniels's lips pressed into a thin line. He couldn't articulate it, but something about Marcus gnawed at him. That name, Bradley, stirred a faint, unshakable memory. "Sit tight," Daniels finally said, his voice clipped. He turned on his heel and marched out of the room, leaving Marcus and the other officer in strained silence. The officer hesitated before speaking, his voice low. "You got someone you can call? A lawyer?" Marcus nodded slowly. "My wife. She's probably worried sick by now." The officer slid a phone across the table. "You can use this. Just keep it quick." Marcus dialed the number with trembling hands, relief flooding him when her voice answered on the other end. "Sharon, it's me," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm at the station. They arrested me." "What?" Sharon's voice was sharp, alarmed. "What happened? Are you okay?" "I'm fine," Marcus assured her, though his heart pounded in his chest. "But I need you to come down here. Bring someone who can help." "I'll be there as soon as I can," she promised, her voice steady despite the panic beneath it. Marcus hung up and slid the phone back across the table. The officer avoided his gaze, his discomfort palpable. Time dragged on, each second stretching into eternity. Marcus stared at the walls, his mind racing. Why had Daniels targeted him? What was this really about? Meanwhile, Daniels paced the hallway outside, his mind churning. The name Bradley wouldn't leave him alone. It clawed at his memory, dragging him back to fragments of a past he'd long since buried. Finally, he pulled out his phone and dialed a number. The voice on the other end answered immediately. "It's Daniels," he said, his tone terse. "I need a file pulled. Old case, maybe 20 years back. Name's Bradley. See what you can find." As he waited for a response, Sharon arrived at the station, flanked by a sharp-dressed attorney who wasted no time demanding answers. "On what grounds was my client arrested?" the attorney demanded, his voice slicing through the tension like a blade. Daniels returned to the room, his expression unreadable. He tossed a file onto the table, its contents spilling out, a collection of yellowed papers and faded photographs. Marcus frowned, leaning forward to get a closer look. His breath caught in his throat as he recognized one of the faces staring back at him from the photos. It was his father, a younger version of the man he'd idolized, standing alongside a group of others in what appeared to be an old police lineup. "What is this?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Daniels didn't answer immediately. He pulled out a chair and sat across from Marcus, his gaze intense. "That man," Daniels said, pointing at the photo. "Was he your father?" Marcus nodded, his heart pounding. "Yes. What does this have to do with anything?" Daniels leaned back, his expression conflicted. "Your father taught me everything I know about this job. He was my mentor when I joined the force." Marcus's mind reeled. He had heard stories about his father's work in the community, his dedication to justice. But what connection could this possibly have to tonight's events? Daniels hesitated, his voice lowering. He believed in doing things the right way, in treating everyone with respect. But I didn't always see eye to eye with him on that. The weight of the admission hung in the air, heavy and charged. "So what?" Marcus demanded, his voice rising. "You took it out on me? Decided to punish me for your disagreements with a man who isn't even here to defend himself?" Daniels flinched, the accusation hitting closer to home than he cared to admit. Before he could respond, the attorney interjected, his tone sharp. "This conversation is over unless you're prepared to release my client immediately." Daniels glanced at Marcus, then back at the attorney. The conflict in his eyes was evident, but he nodded curtly. "Fine," he said. "He's free to go." As the cuffs were removed, Marcus stood, his gaze never leaving Daniels. "This isn't over," Marcus said, his voice steady but firm. "You're going to have to answer for this." Daniels didn't respond, his expression unreadable as Marcus and his wife left the station. But the look in his eyes said everything. This night had changed something in him, though what that was remained to be seen. The silence in the car ride home was heavy, but Marcus felt a sense of resolve building within him. This wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had been wronged by a system that seemed stacked against them. And as he looked out the window at the passing city lights, one thing became clear. This was just the beginning of a much larger fight. The ride home was cloaked in an uneasy silence, broken only by the hum of the engine and the occasional clicking of Sharon's nails against the steering wheel. Marcus stared out of the window, his mind churning. The cold, detached tone of Officer Daniels replayed in his head. "What does your father have to do with any of this?" Sharon's voice broke through his thoughts, soft but tinged with frustration. "I don't know," Marcus admitted, running a hand over his face. "I mean, he never talked much about his time as a mentor. I know he worked with younger officers, but that's about it." Sharon sighed, her knuckles whitening as she tightened her grip on the wheel. "Well, whatever it is, Daniels clearly has a chip on his shoulder. And if he thought he could take it out on you—" "I'll handle it," Marcus interrupted, his tone firm. He turned to meet her gaze, his eyes resolute. "This isn't the first time I've been treated like this, and it probably won't be the last. But I'm not letting him get away with it." Sharon nodded, though the worry in her expression remained. She reached over to squeeze his hand, a gesture of solidarity that anchored him amidst the storm of his thoughts. When they arrived home, the house felt oddly foreign, too quiet, too still. Marcus dropped his bag by the door and sank into the couch, his shoulders sagging under the weight of the evening. Sharon disappeared into the kitchen, returning moments later with 2 cups of tea. "What's the next step?" she asked, settling beside him. Marcus took a sip, letting the warmth steady him. "I don't know yet," he said, "but I'm going to start by looking into my father's past. If Daniels had some grudge against him, there's got to be more to this story." The next morning, Marcus dug out the old box of his father's belongings that had been gathering dust in the attic for years. Inside were faded photographs, police commendations, and letters that hinted at a man deeply respected by his peers. One letter, in particular, caught his attention. It was handwritten, the ink slightly smudged, but the name at the bottom was unmistakable: Officer Thomas Daniels. Marcus's heart raced as he unfolded the letter. The tone was formal, almost clinical, but there was a bitterness in the words that was impossible to miss. Officer Bradley, your methods may work for you, but they don't reflect the reality of the streets. I've watched you give second chances to people who don't deserve them, and I'm tired of cleaning up the mess. One day, your blind idealism is going to cost you more than you realize. Marcus read the letter twice, then a third time, his mind struggling to piece together the implications. "Sharon," he called, his voice tight. She appeared in the doorway, her expression concerned. "What is it?" He handed her the letter, watching as her eyes scanned the page. Her brow furrowed, and when she looked up, her gaze was sharp. This sounds personal," she said. "Like Daniels felt threatened by your father's way of doing things." Marcus nodded. "And now he's projecting that onto me. But why now? Why after all these years?" The answer came unexpectedly, in the form of a knock at the door. Marcus and Sharon exchanged a wary glance before Marcus approached, opening it cautiously. Standing on the porch was an older woman, her face lined with worry. Her salt and pepper hair was pulled into a neat bun, and she clutched a thick folder against her chest. "Are you Marcus Bradley?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "I am," Marcus replied, stepping aside to let her in. "Who are you?" "My name is Patricia Daniels," she said, her gaze meeting his. "I'm Officer Daniels's mother." The revelation hit Marcus like a freight train, and for a moment, he could only stare. "Why are you here?" She took a deep breath, clutching the folder tighter. "Because my son has made a terrible mistake, and you deserve the truth." Sharon guided Patricia to the living room, where she sat down heavily, her hands trembling as she opened the folder. "These are reports, letters, things my son has been keeping hidden," Patricia began, spreading the documents across the coffee table. "He was jealous of your father, resented him, even. Thomas always felt like he was in your father's shadow, like he could never live up to his example." Marcus scanned the documents, his stomach churning. One report detailed a disciplinary hearing where Daniels had been reprimanded for using excessive force, a hearing where Marcus's father had testified against him. Another was a complaint filed by a community member, praising Marcus's father for stepping in when Daniels had overstepped. "This was personal," Marcus said, his voice low. "He's been holding on to this for decades." Patricia nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I tried to talk to him, to make him see reason, but Thomas is stubborn. He's let that resentment fester, and now it's poisoning everything he does." Marcus leaned back, his mind racing. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they painted was darker than he'd anticipated. "What do I do with all of this?" he asked, gesturing to the documents. "You expose him," Sharon said firmly, her voice cutting through the tension. "This isn't just about you anymore, Marcus. It's about everyone he's hurt because of this grudge." Patricia hesitated, her expression pained. "He's my son," she said softly. "But you're right. He needs to be held accountable." Marcus nodded, a plan beginning to form. He would take the evidence to the police oversight committee, ensure that Daniels's actions were brought to light. But as the night wore on, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Daniels wouldn't go down without a fight, and the road ahead would be anything but easy. Yet as he looked at Sharon and Patricia, their determination mirroring his own, he knew he wouldn't face it alone. The days following Patricia Daniels's visit were a whirlwind of uncertainty and preparation. Marcus spent hours poring over the documents she had provided, each page revealing another layer of Officer Daniels's vindictiveness. The deeper he delved, the more he realized how extensive the damage was. Complaints swept under the rug, reports conveniently misplaced, witnesses too scared to speak out. It was a tapestry of corruption, and Daniels sat smugly at its center. But Marcus also knew that exposing the truth would come with risks. Daniels had wielded his authority like a weapon for years, and Marcus had no doubt that he would retaliate if he felt threatened. "Are you sure about this?" Sharon asked one evening, her voice quiet but firm. She sat across from Marcus at the dining table, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea. The dim light cast soft shadows across her face, but her eyes burned with concern. "I don't think I have a choice," Marcus replied, leaning back in his chair. He glanced at the scattered papers spread before him, then met Sharon's gaze. "If I don't do something, he'll keep getting away with it. And next time, it might be someone who doesn't have the resources to fight back." Sharon nodded slowly, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Just promise me you'll be careful. He's not going to take this lying down." Marcus reached across the table and took her hand. "I promise." The following morning, Marcus made his way to the city's Civilian Oversight Board. The building was unassuming, tucked away in a quiet corner of downtown, but inside, it buzzed with a tense energy. Marcus sat in the waiting room, the folder of evidence clutched tightly in his hands. His heartbeat drummed in his ears, and he forced himself to take slow, steady breaths. A stern-looking woman in a gray suit appeared at the door. "Mr. Bradley? They're ready for you." Marcus nodded and stood, his legs feeling like lead as he followed her down a narrow hallway. The room she led him to was modest but imposing, with a long table at its center and a panel of individuals seated behind it. Their expressions were neutral, their eyes sharp. "Mr. Bradley," the chairperson said, gesturing to an empty seat. "Please, have a seat and tell us what brings you here." Marcus swallowed hard and sat down. He placed the folder on the table and opened it, his hands trembling slightly. "I'm here to report misconduct by Officer Thomas Daniels," he began, his voice steady despite the nerves twisting in his gut. "This folder contains evidence of a pattern of abuse and corruption spanning years." He began to lay out his case, walking the panel through each piece of evidence. He spoke of his own experience, the wrongful arrest, and how it had led him to uncover Daniels's long history of misconduct. As he spoke, he noticed the panel members exchanging glances, their expressions shifting from skepticism to concern. When he finished, the chairperson leaned forward, her hands clasped in front of her. "Thank you, Mr. Bradley. This is troubling, to say the least. We'll need to investigate further, but rest assured, we take these allegations very seriously." Marcus nodded, relief washing over him, but it was short-lived. As he exited the building, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw an unknown number flashing on the screen. Hesitating for a moment, he answered. "Marcus Bradley," he said cautiously. A low, familiar voice came through the line. "You think you're smart, don't you?" Marcus's blood ran cold. It was Daniels. "Making moves behind my back," Daniels continued, his tone dripping with venom. "You have no idea who you're messing with." Marcus's grip on the phone tightened. "I'm not afraid of you, Daniels. Your time is up." A harsh laugh echoed through the receiver. "We'll see about that," Daniels said before the line went dead. Marcus stood frozen on the sidewalk, the phone still pressed to his ear. The threat was clear, and he knew Daniels wouldn't hesitate to make good on it. As he lowered the phone, a sinking feeling settled in his chest. The fight was far from over. Over the next few days, Marcus found himself constantly looking over his shoulder. Sharon insisted he stay home while she reached out to a trusted friend in the legal field for advice. But the unease was palpable. Every knock at the door, every shadow cast across the window, set Marcus on edge. One evening, as Marcus sat in the living room, sorting through more of his father's old belongings, Sharon came in holding her phone. "Marcus," she said, her voice tight. "You need to see this." She handed him the phone, and Marcus's stomach dropped as he read the article displayed on the screen. Local teacher accused of fabricating claims against police officer. The story painted Marcus as a disgruntled citizen trying to smear a decorated officer's reputation, complete with anonymous sources defending Daniels's character. "They're trying to discredit me," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. He looked up at Sharon, his jaw clenched. "He's playing dirty." Sharon placed a hand on his shoulder. "We'll fight this, Marcus. The truth is on our side." But Marcus wasn't so sure anymore. Daniels had years of influence and connections to fall back on, and the article was proof that he wasn't above using them to protect himself. That night, Marcus couldn't sleep. The weight of the situation bore down on him, and every time he closed his eyes, he saw Daniels's smug face or the mocking words of the article. He got up and paced the living room, his mind racing. A sudden noise outside made him freeze. It was faint, barely audible over the hum of the refrigerator, but it was there. He crept to the window and peeked through the blinds, his heart pounding. A figure stood across the street, partially obscured by the shadows of a large oak tree. They were still, almost unnervingly so, but Marcus could feel their gaze. He stepped back from the window, his breath quickening. "Sharon," he whispered urgently, rushing to her room. "Wake up." She stirred groggily but sat up when she saw the look on his face. "What is it?" "There's someone outside," Marcus said. "I think they're watching the house." Sharon's eyes widened, and she grabbed her phone. "We're calling the police." Marcus hesitated. What if they're in on it?" "Not all of them are like Daniels," Sharon said firmly. "We have to do something." As she dialed, Marcus returned to the window. The figure was gone, but the unease remained. The next morning, the tension in the Bradley household was palpable. Sharon had barely slept after calling the police the night before. An officer had come by, taking their statement and assuring them that patrols would increase in the area. But Marcus knew better than to feel reassured. He couldn't shake the image of the shadowy figure standing beneath the oak tree, still as a statue, yet so charged with intent that it left him restless. As the first rays of sunlight filtered through the curtains, Marcus sat at the dining table, his laptop open, scouring forums and legal advice blogs for strategies on handling smear campaigns. Sharon appeared in the doorway, clutching 2 mugs of coffee, her tired eyes scanning his face. "Anything useful?" she asked, sliding one of the mugs toward him. Marcus took a sip, shaking his head. "Mostly the same advice. Document everything, stick to the facts, and stay calm." He leaned back in his chair, the tension in his shoulders refusing to ease. "But calm doesn't win battles like this." Sharon sat across from him, placing a hand over his. "Marcus, you're not fighting this alone. Remember that." Before he could respond, his phone buzzed loudly against the table. The number was blocked. Sharon's face darkened as Marcus stared at the screen. After a moment's hesitation, he picked it up and answered. "Marcus Bradley," he said, his voice steady. A familiar voice chuckled on the other end. "You're persistent, I'll give you that," Daniels said. "But you're also out of your league. Thought you'd want to know." "What do you want, Daniels?" Marcus asked, gripping the phone tightly. He gestured to Sharon, who scrambled to activate the voice recorder on her own phone. "What I want," Daniels said, his tone casual, almost mocking, "is for you to back off. You're stirring up trouble that's only going to blow back on you. Think about your family, your job. Is it really worth all this?" Marcus's jaw tightened. "The truth is always worth it." Daniels let out a low laugh. "Brave words for someone with so much to lose. You have no idea how messy things can get, Bradley. You might want to think twice before pushing this any further." Before Marcus could respond, the line went dead. He set the phone down, his heart pounding. Sharon ended the recording and looked at him, her face pale but resolute. "We need to take this to someone higher up," she said. "He's trying to intimidate you." That day, Marcus took the recording to Patricia Daniels. The retired detective listened intently, her brow furrowing deeper with each passing second. When it ended, she let out a slow breath and leaned back in her chair. "That's definitely Daniels," she said. "He always did have a knack for threats." "He's escalating," Marcus said, his frustration evident. "And the article he planted in the paper? It's turning people against me. Parents at the school are already whispering. If I don't clear my name soon, I'll lose my job." Patricia nodded, her expression thoughtful. "We need to move fast then. The oversight board will investigate, but they're slow. If we're going to force their hand, we need to bring this to the public." Marcus's stomach churned. "You're saying we go public with this?" "Not you directly," Patricia clarified. "I've got connections with a few journalists who've been looking to expose corruption in the department. If we give them the evidence and the recording, they can amplify the story. Once it's out there, Daniels won't be able to bury it." Marcus hesitated. The idea of his name plastered across headlines, his life under a microscope, was daunting. But the alternative, letting Daniels continue unchecked, was worse. "Let's do it," he said finally. That evening, Marcus and Patricia met with a reporter named Elaine Harper in a quiet corner of a local coffee shop. Elaine was sharp-eyed and brisk, her notepad ready as she listened to Marcus recount his story. She asked pointed questions, her pen flying across the page as Marcus laid out the evidence. "This is solid," she said when he finished. "If what you're saying checks out, this could be explosive." Patricia slid the recording across the table. "It'll check out," she said. "And this should help." Elaine slipped the recorder into her bag and stood. "Give me a couple of days to corroborate everything. Once I have enough, I'll publish the story." As she left, Marcus felt a sliver of hope pierce through the fog of dread. But it was short-lived. As he and Patricia walked to their cars, Marcus noticed a black SUV idling across the street. The windows were tinted, but he could feel eyes on him. "That SUV's been there since we arrived," he said under his breath. Patricia glanced at it, her expression hardening. "Keep walking. Don't look back." They reached their cars, and Patricia placed a hand on Marcus's arm. "Be careful, Marcus. Daniels isn't going to go down without a fight." The next day, Marcus arrived at school to find whispers and side glances following him down the halls. A colleague approached him in the teacher's lounge, her expression uneasy. "Have you seen this?" she asked, handing him her phone. On the screen was another article, this one painting him as a radical activist with a vendetta against law enforcement. "They're doubling down," Marcus muttered, his anger simmering. "This is all Daniels." His colleague hesitated. "If you need someone to vouch for your character, I'm here," she said quietly. The gesture was small, but it gave Marcus strength. He thanked her and returned to his classroom, determined to stay focused. But as the day wore on, the tension mounted. Parents began pulling their children out of his class, and by lunchtime, the principal called him into the office. "I'm sorry, Marcus," the principal said, his tone heavy with regret. "Until this clears up, I'm going to have to place you on administrative leave." Marcus felt the air leave his lungs. "You can't be serious. I haven't done anything wrong." "I know that," the principal said, "but the district's receiving too much pressure. My hands are tied." As Marcus left the office, the weight of the fight ahead pressed down on him. Daniels was coming at him from all sides, and the cracks in his life were beginning to show. But as he drove home that evening, he resolved not to give up. He had come too far to back down now, and somewhere, beneath the fear and exhaustion, a spark of determination burned brighter than ever. As Marcus pulled into his driveway, the familiar sight of his modest home, with its neat lawn and potted plants by the porch, failed to bring him the comfort it usually did. Sharon was waiting by the front door, her arms crossed and her face tight with worry. The sight of her like that made his chest ache, but he straightened his back and stepped out of the car. "They suspended you, didn't they?" Sharon asked as he approached, her voice subdued but heavy with understanding. Marcus nodded. "It's only temporary, but it feels like a victory for Daniels." Sharon sighed deeply, opening the door and motioning him inside. The house smelled of roasted chicken, a meal she'd probably made to try and keep things normal for their daughter, Maya. But the weight of their circumstances hung thick in the air, making every step into the house feel heavier. Maya was at the dining table, her crayons spread across the surface as she colored in a picture of a sunflower. She looked up as her father entered, her face lighting up. "Daddy, look at what I made." Marcus forced a smile, kneeling beside her. "That's beautiful, sweetheart. You're going to have to teach me how to draw like that." Maya giggled, oblivious to the tension between her parents. Marcus kissed her forehead before standing, catching Sharon's gaze as she tilted her head toward the kitchen. They stepped in together, the door closing softly behind them. "I'm scared, Marcus," Sharon admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't just about your job anymore. They're trying to destroy you." "I know," Marcus said, his jaw tightening, "but I can't let them win. If I back down now, Daniels will get away with it all. His corruption, the smear campaign, everything." Sharon placed a hand on his arm. "I believe in you. I always have. But you have to be smart about this. Promise me you'll stay safe." "I promise," Marcus said, though the words felt hollow. He wasn't sure what safe even meant anymore. Later that evening, as Marcus sat in his study reviewing the evidence Patricia had helped him compile, his phone buzzed with a text. It was from an unknown number. He hesitated, his thumb hovering over the screen, before opening it. "You're making a big mistake, Bradley. Back off before it's too late." A chill ran down his spine. The message was blunt, its implications clear. Marcus immediately called Patricia, recounting the text as he paced the room. "They're getting desperate," Patricia said on the other end of the line. "It means you're close to something." "Close to what?" Marcus asked, his frustration spilling over. "All I have are pieces of a puzzle. I need something definitive, something that ties Daniels directly to the corruption. Patricia was silent for a moment before speaking again. "There's a warehouse near the docks," she said. "Daniels used to frequent it when I was on the force. It's not on any official records, but it's where a lot of his business was conducted. If he's hiding anything, it's there." Marcus's pulse quickened. "That's exactly what I need." "It's dangerous," Patricia warned. "If Daniels finds out you're snooping around, he won't hesitate to retaliate." Marcus exhaled slowly. "I'll be careful, but this might be my only chance." That night, Marcus parked his car a few blocks away from the docks, the cool night air biting at his skin as he approached the warehouse on foot. The area was eerily quiet, the usual hum of city life replaced by the distant sound of waves lapping against the shore. The warehouse loomed ahead, its weathered walls and broken windows giving it an air of abandonment. Marcus crouched behind a stack of shipping crates, surveying the area. A single light flickered above the warehouse door, and he could make out two figures standing guard. His heart pounded as he realized the extent of what he was up against. This wasn't just a smear campaign or a few threats. This was an operation, and Daniels was at the center of it. He waited, his breath shallow, until one of the guards stepped away to light a cigarette. The other seemed distracted, checking his phone. Marcus seized the opportunity, slipping around the side of the warehouse. He found a window that had been cracked open, just enough for him to push it up and climb through. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of oil and mildew. The warehouse was dimly lit, but Marcus could make out stacks of crates and a few desks cluttered with papers. He moved cautiously, his footsteps muffled by the grime-covered floor. He approached one of the desks, his fingers trembling as he sifted through the documents. Invoices, bank transfers, names he recognized from his research. It was all there, a paper trail connecting Daniels to money laundering, illegal arms deals, and bribes. Marcus quickly snapped photos with his phone, his hands steady despite the adrenaline surging through his veins. But as he turned to leave, he heard the unmistakable sound of a door creaking open. Voices followed, low and tense, growing louder with each passing second. Marcus ducked behind a stack of crates, his heart hammering in his chest. "You sure this place is secure?" one voice asked. "It better be," another replied. "If Bradley finds out about this, we're screwed." Marcus froze. They were talking about him. The next few minutes felt like an eternity. Marcus held his breath, his mind racing as he listened to the men move through the warehouse. He could hear the scrape of boots against the floor, the shuffle of papers being moved around. "Check the perimeter," one of them said. "I don't want any surprises." Marcus waited until the footsteps faded before inching his way toward the window. His escape was slow and deliberate, every movement calculated to avoid detection. When he finally slipped out into the night air, relief washed over him, but only briefly. He knew the danger wasn't over. As he hurried back to his car, he glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see Daniels himself emerging from the shadows. The evidence on his phone felt like a ticking time bomb in his pocket. He needed to get it to Patricia, and fast. But as he started the car and pulled away, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Somewhere in the distance, a pair of headlights flickered to life, following him into the darkness. Marcus gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles turning white as the distant headlights seemed to mirror his every turn. The dark, winding streets offered no solace, their shadows elongating into ominous figures. His breathing was steady, controlled, but his mind was racing. He checked the rearview mirror again. Still there? The car following him kept a careful distance, as if trying not to alert him while simultaneously ensuring he knew he wasn't alone. His phone buzzed on the passenger seat, making him flinch. He glanced at the screen. Patricia's name illuminated the dark interior of the car. He pressed the call button on the dashboard, his voice low and tense. "Patricia, someone's tailing me. Are you sure?" Her voice sharpened, concern laced through her words. "Yes, I'm sure. They're keeping their distance, but they're not backing off. I've got the evidence. I need to get somewhere safe." Patricia hesitated. "Okay, don't drive straight home. Head to the safe house on 14th and Elm. I'll meet you there." Marcus nodded instinctively, though she couldn't see him. "Got it." He ended the call and took a sharp left turn, hoping to lose his tail. The pursuing car responded in kind, its headlights flashing briefly as it adjusted to his erratic maneuver. Marcus pressed his foot harder on the accelerator, the engine growling as he wove through the empty streets. Adrenaline pumped through his veins, sharpening his focus. The safe house was an unassuming, run-down building tucked between two abandoned factories. Marcus parked in the alley behind it, his hands trembling slightly as he killed the engine. He grabbed his phone and the small flash drive he'd taken from the warehouse, stuffing them into his jacket pocket. The following car hadn't turned into the alley. Maybe he'd lost them. He stepped out of the car, his senses on high alert. The night was unnervingly quiet, broken only by the faint hum of the city in the distance. Marcus moved quickly to the side entrance of the safe house, punching in the code Patricia had given him. The door clicked open, and he slipped inside, locking it behind him. The interior was sparse but functional. A small couch, a table littered with old newspapers, and a kitchenette that looked like it hadn't been used in years. Marcus paced the room, his phone in hand, waiting for Patricia. Every creak of the floorboards and groan of the old pipes made him jump. 20 minutes later, the door opened, and Patricia stepped in, her expression grim. She carried a laptop and a small duffel bag. "You weren't followed?" "I don't think so," Marcus said, though doubt lingered in his voice. "But they were on me for a while." Patricia set the laptop on the table, her movements precise and efficient. "Let's see what you've got." Marcus handed her the flash drive. "It's all here. Bank records, invoices, connections to Daniels. It's enough to bury him." Patricia plugged the drive into the laptop, her eyes scanning the screen as the files opened. Her face hardened as she scrolled through the documents. "This is big, Marcus. Bigger than I thought. If this gets out, Daniels won't just lose his job. He'll be looking at serious prison time." "That's the goal," Marcus said, though his voice carried a heavy weight. He leaned against the wall, running a hand over his face. "But he's not going to go down without a fight. He'll come after me, Sharon, even Maya." Patricia looked up, her expression softening. "That's why we need to be smart about this. We can't just release this to the press. We need a plan." Before they could discuss further, a loud bang echoed through the alley outside. Both of them froze, their eyes darting toward the door. Patricia reached into her duffel bag and pulled out a handgun, checking the chamber with practiced ease. "Stay here," she whispered, moving toward the door. "Patricia, wait," Marcus started, but she held up a hand to silence him. She peered through the peephole, her body tense. "It's just one guy. Looks like a scout. Daniel's people?" Marcus asked, his heart racing. "Probably. They're testing the waters." Patricia motioned for Marcus to stay put as she cracked the door open, her gun at the ready. The man outside was tall, dressed in dark clothing, and armed. He didn't see Patricia until it was too late. With swift precision, she disarmed him, slamming the door shut before he could call for backup. "What do we do now?" Marcus asked as Patricia secured the unconscious man with zip ties from her back. "We don't have much time," Patricia said, her voice steady. "They know you're here. We need to move." As they gathered their things, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. The evidence they had was powerful, but Daniel's reach was long, and his retaliation was inevitable. Marcus glanced at Patricia, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to his growing anxiety. "Do you think we can win this?" he asked quietly. Patricia met his gaze, her expression unwavering. "We have to. For you, for your family, and for everyone Daniels has hurt." Marcus nodded, steeling himself. The road ahead was treacherous, but he knew he couldn't back down. Not now. Not ever. Patricia motioned for Marcus to help her gather the laptop and flash drive. The unconscious man tied up on the floor groaned softly, his head lolling to one side. The sight of him sent a shiver through Marcus. He was no stranger to conflict, but seeing a person subdued and bound in front of him made the situation feel dangerously real. "Where are we going?" Marcus asked, his voice low but edged with urgency. "We can't stay here," Patricia replied, zipping up her duffel bag. Her movements were sharp and precise, a clear indication she had been in high-pressure situations before. "If he's here, It's only a matter of time before more show up. Daniels has his people everywhere. Marcus looked down at the man. What about him? We can't just leave him. We're not, Patricia said, kneeling to check the man's pockets. She pulled out a phone, examined it briefly, and then tossed it onto the table. But we also can't drag him along. We'll lock him in here. By the time he wakes up and figures out a way out, we'll be long gone. Patricia took a moment to search the man's coat, retrieving a small device that looked like a GPS tracker. Her face darkened as she turned it over in her hands. They've been watching you, Marcus. This was probably in his car, but there's no guarantee they didn't already tag yours. Marcus's stomach twisted. I ditched my car a few blocks away and came here on foot. Do you think they can still track me? Maybe, Patricia said, pocketing the tracker. But we're not going to wait around to find out. We'll use the back alleys and head to a safe zone I know. It's off the grid. The night air was bitterly cold as they slipped out the back door of the safe house. The alley was narrow, lit only by the pale glow of a distant street lamp. Patricia moved swiftly, her gun held low but ready. Marcus followed closely, clutching the duffel bag with trembling hands. Every sound, the rustle of leaves, the hum of distant traffic, felt amplified, like a warning that danger was just around the corner. Stay close, Patricia whispered, and keep quiet. They navigated through the labyrinth of alleys, their footsteps muffled against the damp pavement. Marcus's mind raced with questions and fears. What if Daniel's men were already circling the area? What if Patricia's safe zone wasn't as secure as she thought? He was about to voice his concerns when Patricia abruptly stopped and held up a hand. Marcus froze, his breath catching in his throat. What is it? He whispered. Patricia didn't answer immediately. She tilted her head, listening intently. A faint sound, a rhythmic tapping, like footsteps, echoed from somewhere behind them. They're close, she murmured, her grip tightening on the gun. We need to move faster. The tapping grew louder, accompanied by low voices. Marcus felt his chest tighten as adrenaline coursed through him. He glanced over his shoulder, but saw nothing in the darkness. Patricia, he hissed, his voice shaking. They're right behind us. I know, she replied tersely, her eyes scanning their surroundings. There's an old subway entrance up ahead. We can lose them underground. They broke into a run, the weight of the duffel bag making Marcus's arms ache. The voices behind them grew sharper, more distinct. There. I see them, someone shouted. A shot rang out, the sound deafening in the confined space of the alley. Marcus instinctively ducked, his heart pounding wildly. Patricia spun around, firing back with calculated precision. Keep moving, she barked. The subway entrance was barely visible, concealed by overgrown weeds and a rusted gate. Patricia kicked the gate open, ushering Marcus inside. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay. They descended the cracked concrete stairs, their footsteps echoing in the vast, empty space below. The subway tunnel was dark and oppressive, the faint glow of emergency lights casting eerie shadows on the walls. Patricia guided them deeper, her flashlight cutting through the gloom. We should be safe here for now, she said, her voice low but steady. Marcus leaned against the wall, gasping for breath. His entire body trembled with a mix of fear and exhaustion. This is insane, he muttered. I didn't sign up for this. Patricia crouched beside him, her expression softening. I know it's a lot, Marcus, but you're the key to taking Daniels down. If we don't fight back, he'll keep doing this to people, destroying lives, tearing families apart. Is that what you want? Marcus met her gaze, his eyes filled with doubt and pain. No, but I'm just a teacher. I'm not cut out for this. You're more than just a teacher, Patricia said firmly. You've already done more than most people would. You found the evidence. You're standing up to him. That takes courage. Their conversation was cut short by the distant sound of footsteps echoing through the tunnel. Patricia's face hardened, and she motioned for Marcus to stay quiet. She extinguished the flashlight, plunging them into near-total darkness. They found us, she whispered. Marcus's pulse quickened as the footsteps grew louder, accompanied by the faint glow of flashlights in the distance. Patricia gripped her gun, her eyes narrowing. "Stay behind me," she said, her voice a tense whisper. The tunnel suddenly felt suffocating, the walls closing in as the danger approached. Marcus clenched his fists, his mind racing. He couldn't let Daniels win. He couldn't let this be the end. The footsteps stopped, the silence even more unsettling than the noise. Then, a voice rang out, cold and mocking. "You can't hide forever, Marcus. We'll find you. And when we do, you'll wish you'd stayed in your classroom where you belong." Marcus swallowed hard, his fear slowly giving way to a simmering anger. He glanced at Patricia, her expression unreadable in the dim light. "We're not running anymore," he said quietly, his voice steady for the first time. Patricia raised an eyebrow but said nothing. She simply nodded, her grip tightening on the gun as they prepared to face whatever came next. The tunnel seemed to stretch endlessly, a silent witness to the cat-and-mouse game unfolding within its depths. The voice of their pursuer echoed ominously, each word reverberating off the walls like a taunt. Marcus felt the hairs on his neck stand on end, his fists clenching in defiance. Beside him, Patricia was a statue of calm intensity, her gaze locked on the faint glow of flashlights approaching from the distance. "Keep your breathing steady," Patricia whispered, her tone a blend of command and reassurance. "The key to survival is staying composed." Marcus nodded, though his heart was anything but calm. His mind raced with thoughts of escape, countermeasures, and the overwhelming fear of capture. Every muscle in his body tensed as he tried to control the rising tide of panic. "They think we're cornered," Patricia muttered under her breath, her lips barely moving. "That's their mistake." Marcus glanced at her, searching for clarity. "What do you mean?" "They've underestimated you," she said, a flicker of a smirk crossing her lips. "You're not just some teacher. You're the man who uncovered the truth, who stood up when others stayed silent. That makes you more dangerous to them than they realize." Despite the gravity of their situation, Marcus felt a flicker of determination reignite within him. Patricia's words were like fuel, feeding the small flame of courage he had left. He couldn't let fear control him, not now. The approaching footsteps grew louder, accompanied by faint murmurs. Marcus strained to catch their words, but the echoes distorted them into an unintelligible cacophony. Patricia motioned for him to move closer to the wall, where a narrow alcove provided a shred of cover. He obeyed, his heart pounding in his chest. "Stay here," she instructed, her voice barely audible. "I'll draw their attention." "What?" Marcus hissed, his voice rising slightly before he caught himself. "That's suicide." Patricia shot him a sharp look, her eyes narrowing. "Do you trust me?" Marcus hesitated, his breath hitching. Trust was a complicated thing, especially in a situation like this. But as he looked at Patricia, her unwavering resolve, her calm under pressure, he found himself nodding. "Yes," he said, the word leaving his lips before he fully processed it. "Good," Patricia replied, her expression softening for a brief moment. "Then stay quiet and wait for my signal. We're not going down without a fight." Before Marcus could protest further, Patricia slipped out of the alcove, her movements fluid and deliberate. She stayed low, her gun at the ready, her silhouette barely visible in the dim light. Marcus pressed himself against the wall, every nerve in his body screaming at him to run, to act, to do anything but wait. The tunnel was eerily silent now, save for the sound of footsteps. Patricia moved with precision, her eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of their pursuers. She knew the risks of her plan, but she also knew it was their best shot at survival. If she could create a diversion, even for a few moments, it might give Marcus the chance he needed to escape. The first figure emerged from the shadows, a man clad in dark tactical gear. He held a flashlight in one hand, its beam cutting through the darkness like a knife. Patricia ducked behind a pillar, her breathing steady as she assessed the situation. The man's movements were methodical, his eyes scanning every inch of the tunnel. Patricia waited, her finger hovering over the trigger. Timing was everything. She needed to act at the perfect moment, too soon, and she'd reveal herself. Too late, and she'd lose the element of surprise. The man stopped, his flashlight sweeping dangerously close to her position. Patricia tightened her grip on the gun, her mind racing. Then, just as the beam began to drift away, she struck. "Hey!" she shouted, her voice echoing through the tunnel. The man spun around, his flashlight trembling slightly as he raised his weapon. Patricia fired a warning shot, the sound deafening in the confined space. "Drop it!" she commanded, her voice hard and unyielding. The man hesitated, his eyes narrowing as he assessed her. Patricia could see the gears turning in his head, the split-second calculations of a trained operative. But she didn't give him the chance to act. With a swift motion, she fired again, the bullet striking the ground mere inches from his feet. "I said, drop it," she barked, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. The man complied, his weapon clattering to the floor. Patricia kept her gun trained on him as she backed away, her heart pounding. She knew she didn't have much time before the others arrived. Back in the alcove, Marcus heard the commotion and felt a surge of panic. Every instinct screamed at him to stay put, but his conscience fought against it. He couldn't let Patricia face this alone. Taking a deep breath, he stepped out of the shadows, his movements cautious but determined. He spotted Patricia a few yards ahead, her gun trained on a figure who stood frozen in the middle of the tunnel. Marcus's eyes widened as he recognized the man. It was one of Daniel's top enforcers, a name that sent chills through the community. "Marcus, what are you doing?" Patricia hissed, her gaze flicking to him for a split second. "I couldn't just stay there," he replied, his voice shaky but resolute. Before Patricia could respond, a new voice rang out, sharp and commanding. "Drop the weapon, Patricia." Both Marcus and Patricia turned to see another figure emerging from the darkness, this one more imposing than the last. He held a gun leveled at them, his expression cold and calculating. "You're outnumbered," the man said, his tone dripping with arrogance. "And your little crusade ends here." Marcus felt his stomach drop. The stakes had just risen, and the odds were no longer in their favor. The tunnel fell silent, the tension thick enough to cut. Marcus's mind raced, searching for a way out. Patricia's jaw tightened as she sized up the new threat, her gun unwavering. The man's smirk deepened, his confidence emanating like a toxic cloud. But Marcus caught something, a faint shimmer of light reflecting off a distant grate. It was small, almost unnoticeable, but enough to trigger a desperate idea. Patricia didn't flinch. "You think this ends here? You think people like us will just roll over and give up?" The man chuckled, his gun steady. "You've already lost. Daniels owns this city. He owns you." "That's where you're wrong," Patricia said, her voice laced with defiance. "People like Daniels rely on fear. But we have something stronger." "And what's that?" the man sneered. "Truth," Marcus interjected, stepping forward. His voice, though trembling, carried a determination that stopped everyone. "The truth always finds a way." In that moment, everything seemed to shift. Marcus moved closer to Patricia, his eyes darting between her and the grate he'd noticed. He nodded slightly, and Patricia understood without a word. "All right," Patricia said, lowering her weapon. "You win." The man tilted his head, suspicious but intrigued. Finally, some sense. Patricia dropped her gun, and it clattered to the floor. Marcus raised his hands, feigning surrender as they moved closer together. The man stepped forward, his smirk triumphant. It was exactly what they needed. In a flash, Patricia lunged for the man's weapon while Marcus darted to the grate. The sound of a struggle echoed through the tunnel, punctuated by grunts and the clang of metal. Patricia's combat training kicked in as she disarmed the man, her movements swift and precise. Marcus, meanwhile, pried open the grate with a broken pipe he'd found, the faint light growing stronger as fresh air poured in. "Now, Marcus!" Patricia yelled as she subdued their attacker. Marcus dived into the opening, turning back just in time to see Patricia following him. They slid through the narrow passage, their breaths ragged as the sound of reinforcements grew louder behind them. The passage opened into a canal, its rushing water a stark contrast to the suffocating tension of the tunnel. By the time they emerged into the open air, the first rays of dawn were breaking through the horizon. The city sprawled before them, bathed in golden light. Marcus collapsed onto the grass, his chest heaving as relief washed over him. Patricia sat beside him, her expression a mix of exhaustion and satisfaction. "We made it," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. Patricia nodded, her gaze distant. "For now. But this isn't over." Marcus turned to her, his brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" Patricia sighed, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Daniels and his men won't stop. They'll come after us, after anyone who stands in their way. But we've got something they don't. The recordings," Marcus realized. "The proof." Patricia nodded. "And we're going to use it. The people deserve to know the truth." Over the next few weeks, Marcus and Patricia worked tirelessly to expose the corruption that had plagued their city for years. The evidence they'd gathered sent shockwaves through the community, sparking protests and investigations. Daniels and his network of enforcers were arrested, their empire crumbling under the weight of their crimes. Marcus returned to his classroom, greeted by his students with cheers and applause. The experience had changed him, deepening his resolve to inspire and educate the next generation. Patricia, meanwhile, joined a task force dedicated to rooting out systemic corruption, her courage becoming a beacon for others. One evening, as Marcus prepared for another week of teaching, he received a message from Patricia. It was a simple text. *, we did it. *. He smiled, his heart swelling with pride. The journey had been harrowing, but it had also proven that change was possible, that justice could prevail when people stood together. And so, the story of Marcus and Patricia became a testament to the power of truth, resilience, and the courage to fight for what's right. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and follow us for more inspiring tales of courage, justice, and humanity. Together, we can make a difference. See you in the next story.